Copper Sun, Part 4, Polly, Chapters 21 and 22. Polly was determined to get a position in the big house. The slave girl was adjusting. Teeny didn't really need her, and Polly was tired of working like a common slave. She waited for her opportunity, praying for a moment alone with Mrs. Derby to ask for a more suitable position in her household. But Teeny kept her busy from dawn to dusk doing what Polly considered to be slave labor, peeling potatoes, shelling peas, shucking corn, and carrying heavy sacks of kindling for the fire. Lots of corn grew on the land, and Polly was consistently impressed by Teeny, who seemed to know thousands of things she could make from it. But Derbyshire Farms was actually a rice plantation. Rice was everywhere. Rice ruled. "Do you think Mr. Derby gets his wealth from the rice?" she asked Teeny one humid afternoon. "Lord, child, what you care about Master Derby's money? All I knows is every year Master Derby go to the market and buy big strong male slaves directly from Africa for to work in the rice fields," she explained. "I was surprised at first when he brung Minor here. Little bitty girl thing. She ain't no bigger than a rock-eating chicken. For sure she ain't strong enough to work the fields," she sighed. "But then I figured out the reason why. I'm sorry, child," she said to Amari. Amari simply shrugged. "Why he buy Africa men?" she asked Teeny. "They knows the rice, 'cause they work it in their own country. They the brains of the whole project here. Massa won't admit it, but he need them men to keep this place going. They is what's making him rich." Polly pondered this a moment, trying to find any opportunity to move from the kitchen to the house. Perhaps Mr. Derby could use an assistant to help him keep his books. "I can read and cipher, you know," she added with a bit of pride. Teeny snorted. "Ain't much call for none of that round here. That's enough for talking about the masses' money. I want y'all to head over to the rice fields and take this here water to the workers. Tote a little cornbread for 'em, too. Lord knows when they gonna get the time to eat or drink, though." She prepared a large wooden bucket for each girl to carry. Polly groaned inwardly as once again she was given what she considered to be slave duties. "What is the advantage of being white if I have to work like I'm black every day?" she thought with consternation. "Mama would die if she saw me here." Teeny motioned to the boy. "Titbit, you and that dog of yourn go with them and show them the way. But you stay out of that water, you hear? Gators get you." Teeny wiped the sweat from her face. "Yes, Teeny," Polly replied with resignation. She grabbed one of the buckets. "Leave everything with Cato, if he ain't dead yet. He's so old he couldn't cut hot butter with a knife." She laughed at her own joke. "And don't be all day down there. Y'all got work to do back here." Polly gritted her teeth, slowly repeated everything Teeny had said to Amari, even though she figured the girl had already understood most of it, and headed out of the kitchen and down to the river. As they were walking down the path, Polly heard Teeny call out one final warning. "Y'all be careful of snakes now." Titbit laughed, dropped to the ground, and pretended to slither like a snake. Hush Puppy, always ready for a new game, cavorted around Titbit, barking wildly. "Get up, silly boy," Polly said, her grim mood fading. "Your mama will get us if you get any dirtier." The boy got up, but he darted along the path like a little insect, picking up bugs and rocks along the road and tossing sticks for Hush Puppy to chase. "I hate the heat of late summer," Polly remarked, her hair sticking to her face in the humidity. Amari didn't respond, but she seemed to be enjoying the warmth of the sunshine. Polly had never been this far from the big house. She had heard of the rice fields, but she stood amazed at what she saw. 24 black men and women, knee-deep in thick mud, bent over the delicate-looking rice plants. There was no shade anywhere, and Polly could see thick rivulets of sweat running down their faces. They moved slowly, joylessly. "How can people live like this?" Polly thought. "What y'all want?" a wrinkled, skinny slave sitting on the bank of the river asked. His hair, what was left of it, dotted his head like tiny clouds. "Hey, Titbit, how be the little man and his dog?" Titbit bounded over to the old man and gave him a big hug. "Hey, Cato." "Teeny sent corn pone and water for the rice workers," Polly told him. "Hopes they get to eat 'em 'fore the bugs do," he cackled, then almost choked in a spasm of coughing. "So, How it be for the new denture gal? He asked Polly when he got his breath. That sunshine-colored hair of yourn gonna get you out of your indenture right quick, he predicted. All's you need is a lonely little white boy. He laughed at his own comments and then coughed even harder. Polly touched her hair but did not answer him directly. Amari asked him, "You work hard today, Cato?" Polly had learned that Cato, the oldest slave on the plantation, always seemed to know everything that went on while managing to do very little work at all. They ain't got much choice but to let me do pretty much what I wants to nowadays, since they done about worked me dry, he said, chuckling. Right now, I'm working and watching this here grass grow. He laughed and coughed deeply. Cato looked up at Polly then. You two still working in the kitchen? He asked. Polly nodded. Not for long, child. You's a white gal. Soon they gonna have you sewing for Miss Isabel. Polly thrilled at the possibility. But Miss Africa here gonna be down here in the swamps with us, soon as Master Clay get tired of her. Amari let out a soft moan. How do you know this? Polly asked. I ain't the oldest slave on the place for nothing. I hears things and sees things. Maybe it is too soon for her, Polly said, frowning. Amari looked at Polly, a look of surprise on her face. You don't have to convince old Cato. I'm just telling you what I knows. Master loved to see the Africans working the rice. You ever hear tell of anybody going back to Africa? Chpt asked. Cato replied seriously. No, little one, don't nobody go back to Africa. When they put you in the rice fields, you be dead in 5 years. So don't matter how. 5 years? Why? Polly asked, sounding genuinely shocked. Let me explain, Cato replied. I spent 18 years out there. Some kind of record, they tells me. Every day, the rice hands be exposed to the burning sun. Sometimes it seemed like the very air we be breathing is hotter than human blood. Then there's the malaria and the pneumonia and the snakes, plus the mosquitoes and the flies and the maggots, all joining us to keep us company while we sweat. Pregnant women be having stillbirths, and the babies that end up being born die young, like they sickly or something. That's why Massa keep bringing in new Africans. They knows the rice, and they strong. Amari inhaled deeply and looked at Cato, her eyes wide. Hey, boy, Cato called to Chpt as he heard the dog bark with alarm. Get away from that water. You want a gator to eat you? Gator can't catch me, Chpt replied, but he ran back up on the grass. You know how rice be planted? Cato asked the girls as he continued. They shook their heads. One seed at a time. But rice be so small, Amari remarked. Yep, that it is. You makes a hole in the mud with your toe. You drops the one tiny little rice seed in the hole, and then you closes the hole with the heel of your foot. Toe, plant, heel, all day long, bending over, knee deep in swamp water. Cato coughed once more and looked down at the ground. And that's just the first part. Then you got to tend to the plants and flood the fields and cut the stacks and thresh the seeds. Seem like it go on forever. That's what be in your future, Miss Africa. And when he get old enough, this here boy's future too. Polly looked at Cato in disbelief. They put Chpt out there? She asked, horrified. The thoughts of little Chpt sweating and working in the dangerous swampy water made Polly feel ill. Amari put her hand to her mouth, barely holding back a sob. What to do? She finally asked. Cato shrugged. It might help if Miss Isabel like you, but she ain't got no say-so over much round here. I suppose you got to keep on making yourself useful in Master Clay's bedroom. That be all any slave woman can do, Cato explained sadly, lest she run away. At that moment, they heard a blood-curdling scream coming from one of the slaves in the rice field. Cato moved astonishingly quickly for an old man, and he hurried down to see what happened. Polly, Amari, and Chpt followed. Oh, my Lord, Copperhead! A slave named Jacob cried hoarsely. My Hildy been snake bit. Polly watched, horrified, as Jacob emerged from the swampy mud, carrying Hildy's limpy body to the shore. He laid her gently on the grass. Polly could barely see the 2 small wounds on her leg. There was very little blood. Some of the slave women quickly daubed her leg with mud and wrapped it tightly with strips of cloth ripped from their own dresses. The women's eyelids fluttered. She called for her husband, then she arched her back and was still. "She be dead?" Amari asked, her voice barely a whisper. Chpt, for once, was still and quiet. "Not yet," Cato replied quietly. "Just passed out, but the poison likely to kill her by sunset. Copperhead don't play." Cato looked directly at Amari as he spoke again. "2 dead of snake bite this season. 2 more died of the malaria. 1 gator bite, 1 drowned. Do whatever you can to stay out of this here place, gal. You hear?" Amari looked terrified. Polly thought, and rightfully so. As they left the rice fields, Polly could hear the workers being called back to work. No free time, just because of a little snake bite. Chapter 22, Lashed with a Whip. When Polly and Amari returned to Teeny's kitchen, both of them clearly upset. Teeny didn't seem the least bit surprised. "How's Hildy?" she asked as she pulled Chpt close to her. "Cato told us she might die," Polly reported, tucking her shaking hands under her arms, and then she asked, "How do you know?" "I declare, child, you ought to know by now that it don't take long for news to travel round here," Teeny said. "So, did Cato also scare you about how gals like Mina here be ending up in rice fields?" Polly nodded, then frowned. This time last year, when she was back in Beaufort with her folks, she wouldn't have given a second thought to a slave going to work in the rice fields. That's what a slave was supposed to do. Who cared about the feelings of an ignorant slave anyway? But this was someone she knew, maybe even felt sorry for. Somehow, that made a difference. "Cato speaks true," Teeny said solemnly, "but I got an idea. Let's see what we can do. The 2 of you go out back and wash yourself. Get back in here real quick like." The 2 girls returned with clean faces and hands, and Teeny handed them each an outfit worn by the house serving maids. Flora, one of the serving gals, is Hildy's daughter. She done run down there to see to her mama, Teeny explained. "Massa don't allow such behavior, but he don't know yet, so you 2 gonna take her place at supper." Polly and Amari exchanged looks of surprise. "Polly, you just do what Lena, the head serving gal, tells you to do. Say nothing except for yes, sir, and yes, ma'am. Mina, you copy everything they do and act like you know what you doing. You understanding all this, gal?" Polly was pleased that Amari replied as she had been taught, "Yes, Teeny," but she was thrilled about the chance to go work in the big house. Finally. Teeny looked worried, however. "And don't you drop nothing, you hear? Now get," she told them. Polly changed quickly into the stiff black uniform, inwardly praying that perhaps this would be the start of her move up to the main house and out of the kitchen with the slaves. She then helped Amari tie the sash on her apron. Chpt laughed out loud when he saw the 2 girls dressed as maids. Polly shooed him away. "Have you seen Mr. Derby since the first day we arrived here?" she asked Amari as they prepared to take the food to the main house. Amari shook her head. "Not see, which be good." "Have you ever been inside the main house?" Polly asked. Then she gasped as she realized what Amari's answer would be. "Only nighttime," Amari replied harshly. "Oh, Mina, I forgot." "I not forget," Amari stated, her voice sharp as broken glass. "Do you think Mrs. Derby knows what Clay is doing?" "She know," Amari said angrily. "Maybe she can help you," Polly offered tentatively. "She seems to be very pleasant." "She need help herself," Amari replied sharply. Polly tried to understand, but she couldn't truly fathom the depths of Mina's apparent distress. Slave women were always called to the bedrooms of their masters. It was simply a fact of life. Mina should understand that by now and be getting used to it, but she let the subject drop as they prepared to carry the food. Amari took a platter of venison, while Polly carried a huge, glistening corn pone on another large platter. They walked carefully up the path from the kitchen to the big house and entered through the back door. Lena took one look at the 2 girls and rolled her eyes up to the ceiling. "Lord have mercy, we're gonna get in trouble for sure. Tell Teeny if I get to beating over this, I ain't never forgiving her. Now go on back and bring the rest of the food." Polly and Amari dashed back several more times to get the rest of the food for supper for Mr. Derby and his wife. All of it was laid out on the sideboard to be served as Lena directed. Polly looked around the room in rapt curiosity. Now, this is where I belong, she thought with a smile, taking in the dark green curtains covering the windows to keep out the afternoon heat, the fine pale green embroidered carpet decorating each floor, and the pictures of ancient Derby relatives lining the walls. Fancy silver eating and drinking utensils lay in a huge cupboard on the other side of the room. Polly had never seen such finery. Oh, how Mama would have loved this, she thought. Polly tiptoed to peek into the adjoining room, which was obviously Mr. Derby's study. She inhaled with pleasure. Shelves of leather-bound books filled one wall. She'd give anything to simply touch them. To have access to them would be heaven. Her mother had taught her to read using the Bible and occasional pieces of newsprint that came their way, but Polly longed for books of her own. If I could get assigned to the main house, she thought, I would sneak into this room during every moment. She sighed and returned to the dining area. Standing silently near the door of the dining room, almost like a statue, was the coachman who had driven the two girls here from the market just a few months ago. Once again, he was dressed in an elegant coat and a shirt with lace cuffs. This here is Noah, Lena explained. Noah nodded slightly, but continued to stand stiffly and formally. He's the coachman, the butler, Miss Isabel's bodyguard, and probably the fanciest house slave we got around here. Best looking, too, Lena laughed. Master trusts him, and she lowered her voice to a whisper. Word is that Miss Isabel done taught him how to read. Suddenly, Lena cleared her throat and snapped to attention. Polly and Amari did the same. Mr. Derby, dressed in a red velvet suit, escorted his now very pregnant wife into the room. Clay sauntered in behind them, gave a look of undisguised disgust to his stepmother, and sat as far away from her as he could. He seemed to be trying to get Amari's attention, Polly thought, but Amari had dropped her head and refused to look at him. Where's Flora? Mr. Derby demanded as soon as he had helped his wife be seated. Her mama got snake bit today, sir, real bad. She done run to the quarters to see her, Lena explained quickly. But we got something special for your supper today. Yes, we do. Polly, pour the wine like I showed you. Polly hurried to obey. Well, I hope she's not too badly injured, Mr. Derby said irritably. I hate it when my workers are laid up. Mrs. Derby spoke up, although barely audibly. Shall I check on her tomorrow, Percival? No, my dear, I really disapprove of you dealing with the servants. It's not wise in your condition, you know. She might need medical attention, Mrs. Derby suggested softly. I'm sure she'll be fine, her husband said. It is you I worry about, Isabel. Right now, the most important things on my mind are your happiness and comfort, he said firmly, and the safety of our child. I can never forgive myself if anything happened to that baby. I have not been this excited or this happy in many years. He took her hand in his. It seemed to Polly that he gazed at his wife with genuine concern. Mrs. Derby smiled at him, touched her belly, and let the matter drop. Turning to Clay, Mr. Derby said, Son, run down to the quarters tomorrow and get one of the slaves from the fishing gang to take her place. It will be my pleasure, Father, the young man replied lazily. But why not just send Noah? He's able-bodied, perfectly good waste of a strong worker, seems to me. Polly said Clay looked at his stepmother with a wicked grin. Isabel Derby inhaled, then looked at her husband in alarm. You promised, Percival, you promised when we married that I could keep my bodyguard. Mr. Derby's face softened as he put his arm around his wife's shoulders and gave her what seemed to be a reassuring hug. I think Clay is merely teasing you, my dear. I wouldn't think of upsetting you by doing such a thing. All I care about right now is your health and your happiness. To Clay he said, Try to be kinder, son. You'll have a brother or sister soon. Clay rolled his eyes, looked at Mrs. Derby with a disdain, and drank another glass of wine. It was clear to Polly that he truly disliked his stepmother. As they continued to serve the food, Amari looked nervous, so Polly tried to help whenever she thought Amari might not understand a command. She wasn't going to let Amari spoil her chance to impress the Derbys. Noah continued to stand like a sentry at the door, never moving, never displaying any emotion. Mrs. Derby drank very little of the white wine that Amari had carefully poured for her. She had given Amari a pleasant smile, however, and had thanked her as Amari deftly slipped a white linen napkin onto Mrs. Derby's lap. "You must eat more, my dear Isabel," Mr. Derby said to his wife. "You want our child to be healthy, don't you?" She looked up nervously. "Yes, of course, you are right, Percival," she replied. She motioned to Polly to put a little more compound on her plate, but Polly noticed she only nibbled at it. "Please tell Teeny the supper is delicious," Mrs. Derby said to Lena. "Now, don't compliment the slaves on doing their jobs, my dear. Your kindness only makes them weak and careless." It sounded to Polly that Mr. Derby admonished his wife almost as if he were speaking to a child, but he also seemed to dote on her. He touched her constantly, fixing a ringlet of hair that had fallen into her face, brushing a speck from her shawl, and patting her left hand with his right. As Lena skillfully served the stew, venison, corn, and beans to the Derby family, Amari and Polly were kept busy taking plates back to the kitchen, bringing up steaming baskets of bread, and finally a fresh-baked blackberry pie. Mrs. Derby continued to pick at her food, and her husband sometimes stopped his conversation with Clay to cut a small piece of meat for his wife so she would eat it. "Now, don't you feel better?" he would say after she had swallowed it. She would smile wanly in agreement. It seemed to Polly that he treated his wife more like a delicate possession than a real person. Any genuine conversation he seemed to save for his son. "I'm thinking we could bring in a few more slaves," he told Clay. "The rice crop will do well this year, and the market has gone up. Let's plan on making a bigger harvest next season." Clay nodded, casting another glance at Amari. "That means expanding the fields by the river. We'll need fresh Africans for that. They know rice so well." "How many do you think?" his father asked. "3 or 4, at least," Clay replied. "They don't seem to last long out there." "Well, I'll keep my eyes open the next time I go to market," Mr. Derby said. "We best be getting them soon, so they can be broken in by planting time." "They speak about buying slaves the same way they discuss the purchase of cattle or supplies," Polly noticed, surprised at how uncomfortable that made her feel. "When I am the mistress of such a place, will I discuss the purchase of people as they do?" She was not sure of the answer. "Do you think we'll need to sell any slaves to get money for next year's supplies?" Clay asked his father. "Not this season, son. I've monitored the books quite closely, and I think this year we will make quite a profit without selling any property." He seemed pleased. Property. They called the slaves property. Polly thought about the slaves she had come to know since she had come to the plantation. The thought of one of them being sold distressed her in a way she had not thought possible. Without Amari and Teeny and Titbit, how awful it would be here, Polly suddenly realized. Clay Scott stopped to scratch his head, then said to his father, "I hear talk in town of folks in the north starting to speak about ending slavery." Mr. Derby, sipping his third glass of wine, snorted. "That will never happen. Those northerners, they can't even grow the rice they love so much. They know nothing about how a business is run. Rice, tobacco, corn, where do they think it comes from?" Clay, who had even more wine than his father, leaned back on the 2 back legs of his chair carelessly. "Slavery just makes good sense to me. Anyway, our slaves are better off here than in some jungle eating bugs and slugs like savages." "Of course they are. They need us, son." "Mr. Derby is right, isn't he? Living here has got to be better than a jungle, right?" Polly wasn't sure anymore. She could see Lena grinding her teeth in anger. She glanced over at Amari to see her reaction, but Amari stared straight ahead. Isabel Derby sat pale and quiet, her eyes cast down through most of the meal. It was as if she were one of the many room decorations. Unhappiness seemed to ooze from her like perspiration on a humid day. Polly shook her head as she realized that being a fine lady didn't necessarily mean finding joy. Clay's antagonism toward Mrs. Derby was almost palpable. He glared at her every time she picked up a spoon or wiped her lips with a linen napkin. Finally, the meal was over, and the last of the dishes were being removed. Polly, relieved that neither she nor Amari had done anything to call negative attention to themselves, congratulated herself on a successful evening. "I'm going to speak to Mrs. Derby right after dinner," Polly vowed bravely. "This might be my only chance. I will offer my services as her personal assistant. Surely, with the new baby, she will need someone to help her. Mr. Derby finished a last glass of wine, then lit his pipe and stretched his long legs out from his chair just as Amari was walking by with the final platter of leftover blackberry pie. Amari, looking at Polly rather than the floor, tripped over his legs and fell. No, no! Polly breathed as the platter flipped and the pie careened to the floor. Purple red berries splattered onto the pale carpet. There was a moment of absolute silence. Amari cowered on the floor in obvious terror. Polly, too afraid to breathe, waited for the thunderous voice of the master. "You stupid black wench!" he roared. "Lena, go get my whip." Polly gasped at the same moment as Amari did. Polly knew Lena had no choice but to obey. She returned quickly and handed it to Mr. Derby, never looking at him directly. Coiled like a snake, the whip was made of leather. The tip of the lash was laced with wire. Polly inhaled and held her breath. Mr. Derby grasped the handle, drew his arm back, and fiercely brought the braided lash of it across Amari's back. She screamed, twisting with pain at his feet. Again he beat her, and again. 7 times he thrashed her. 10, 12. The back of her new housemaid uniform was ripped to shreds, stained with her blood. Polly clenched her hands into fists, furious at being so helpless and angry at her own selfishness as well. Because even though she flinched every time Amari was hit, she couldn't help but realize that this incident would forever ruin her chances of working in the main house. Lena quietly murmured words of prayer. Horror distorted Mrs. Derby's face. Clay looked surprisingly uncomfortable and agitated. Only Noah never changed his stance or facial expression. Finally, Isabel Derby got up from the table and walked over to her husband. Noticeably trembling, she grabbed his hand as he lifted it to strike Amari again. "Enough," she said quietly. "The girl has learned her lesson. Make her clean up the mess and let her be. It is distressing to me to see such a scene. It might mar our child." Mr. Derby, as if he, returning from another place, shook his head and coiled the whip. "You are right, my dear," he told his wife. He took a deep breath. To Polly, he said, "I put you in charge of this ignorant African. You have failed me. It is your fault she made such a fool of herself tonight. Clean the floor, then tend to her wounds. As soon as she's healed, she goes to the rice fields to replace Hildy." Polly bowed her head and murmured apologies that she knew Mr. Derby would not hear. She dared to look at Omari, who lay deathly still, and at the carpet, stained with both blood and pie. Polly wasn't sure what to do first. She had never been so scared in her life. Mr. Derby escorted his wife out of the room then. Clay, looking quite distressed, gazed at the bleeding and unconscious Mari for a long time before following after them. Noah slowly left the room as well, as his job was protector of the master and his wife. "Vinegar," he whispered as he headed out of the door. "Vinegar will remove the stains from the carpet."